All right, good morning. How's everybody feeling? Yeah? Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers. I'm really excited to be here with you guys this morning. Warsaw is beautiful right now, isn't it? The weather is amazing. Last time I was here was in February, so it's much nicer now. So I'm excited to talk to you guys a little bit about the power of information from the perspective of an American journalist. And I want to talk to you a little bit as well about how we know what we know in our very hyper-connected world, right? So first off, we all know information is everywhere, right? It's in our weather apps that tell us what to get dressed in the morning. It's all the cat videos that we love on YouTube. We find information absolutely everywhere. We're saturated with it. But I think in order for information to really be powerful, people need to have access to it. People need to be able to understand it, and people need to be able to apply it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things, and I'm going to talk about the power of information as it relates to politics, policy. I'm going to talk about the human emotion involved in how we seek out the information that we seek out. And I'm going to talk about the impacts that information has on business and, of course, on money. And I know there's a lot of leaders here in the nonprofit world, so I'm excited to talk to you all about the work that you're doing and how information works for you. And of course, I am coming from Washington, so I will be talking a little bit about our president's Twitter account, a source of information that we're all trying to understand every day. But first, let's go back to a simpler time. This is when Twitter was new. This is CNN Breaking News Twitter. I started at CNN around this time, and this is a true story. When I first started, CNN was offering Twitter classes to its employees. So when I first started, fresh out of college, one of the things I learned was how to tweet. You can judge from my Twitter account whether or not I'm good at that. And around that time, Twitter was new, and so CNN engaged in what can only be described as a dignified competition. Does anybody recognize this guy? Who is he? He's an actor, right? So he was one of the people who was nearing 1 million followers in 2009. At that time, like, nobody had that many followers. And we were a close second. And so he challenged us to a competition, a race to 1 million followers. Do you want to guess who won? Yeah. So it was close, but Ashton Kutcher beat us to 1 million followers. And the way that he celebrated was by making a live stream video. And even though the video is about 10 years old, I think it tells us something important about this moment that we're living through in terms of information and the power of information. So here is Ashton Kutcher's live stream from 2009.
There are 1 million people that need to be thanked for this, and I'm not one of them, because I'm not following me, I'm following you. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate that you have put and invested your time and energy into making this stand and making this sort of announcement to the world about the state of media. We can and will create our media. We can and will edit our media. We can and will broadcast our media. We will censor our own media ourselves. We are over 1 million. CNN is still trying to get there, and that's just the way that goes.
All right, so grandstanding aside, I think the point that he makes about this question of the power of information and who has it, right? That was a shift that we were living through, and we're still living through the implications of that. So back when my company was started, back in the good old days of 1980, information really flowed one way, right? Journalists, professional broadcasters, we collected information and we sent it to our audience. The power flowed one way. Sometimes we would hear calls from viewers who said, "Why are you doing this?" But mostly, we figured out the news and we sent it to you guys. And print journalists did that before we did, right? But of course, we all now are competing for attention. You guys are mostly in the nonprofit sector. You're competing for attention too, right? You're doing good work. You want people to pay attention to it. And anybody who has a smartphone is now in the information production business. And of course, there's more smartphones than people in the world now. It's a crowded space. We're now very much in this era where the conversations that happen in the informal information space very much drive the conversations in the professional space. So stories that are trending on Facebook or Twitter, they're going to capture the attention of professionals in newsrooms around the world. The power is now flowing both ways in terms of the information. That's where we are. And in the United States, there's been a couple big stories that really illustrate this power. One of them is Black Lives Matter, and another one is Me Too. Everybody knows Me Too? Yeah. So Me Too is very much this conversation that happened in private spaces, right? Sexual harassment is not new. This is a conversation that women were having with women. And suddenly, that information escaped from these private conversations into the broader community. And the power of that is huge. So you see, around the world, people are talking about this, especially in Sweden. I don't know. And the power of this has had some really profound implications. We've had Hollywood companies that have gone bankrupt. People who have enjoyed towering figures like Bill Cosby, famous comedian in the United States, have been criminally convicted of sex crimes. It's really changed a lot in the United States, and not just on the individual level. You can see here that as this information is flowing in the broader conversation, that attitudes are changing in the US. Like you see here, especially this bottom one, the change from 1998 to 2017 in terms of how people are viewing and thinking about sexual harassment. This is the power of information. And again, this is information that is flowing first from people who are talking about it on social platforms. So this is a big deal. But we're also in this era where sometimes the power of information, there's something else going on than what's immediately obvious. So, in the United States, at the beginning of this year, there was a hashtag that started trending. It was hashtag release the memo. And you can see here, in 2 days, the traffic on this particular hashtag went up by over 200,000%, which is huge, right? And so for a lot of people, you look at that hashtag and you say, wow, a lot of people are talking about this. What is this memo, right? Well, the memo had to do with something that allies of President Trump thought might help him in his fight against this investigation into his campaign. Researchers who look at this stuff said, oh, this hashtag isn't being just tweeted by regular users, it's being tweeted by bots. And so as this hashtag gets going on Twitter, from Twitter it goes to conservative media. And on conservative media, this particular host is a favorite of President Trump. He talks about it a lot in the evening. We start talking about it on CNN, and the president, in a matter of days, ends up releasing this memo, doing what the hashtag said, right? And so here we see very much the power of information these days can move so quickly. It can move from a hashtag, which is perhaps promoted by bots, to actual political actions in the United States. And we see a lot of this. This is by far one small example, right? So this is a question that we're all contending with every day. How do we know what we know, and what do we do with that information that we see? These are Facebook groups that were made to look like regular American Facebook groups, but in actuality they were created by troll farms based in St. Petersburg. And so this is something that has an impact, the power of information, and it's something that we need to be thinking about as we're going through and we're evaluating the information that we're confronted with and what we're going to do with it. These Facebook accounts actually were able to get people to do sometimes strange things. So one of these Facebook accounts was called Being Patriotic. And it was a group about being patriotic in the United States. And one of the things they were able to get people to do was to build a cage and dress up like Hillary Clinton in the lead up to the election. The person who built this cage was an American guy, and he was very confused to realize that he was actually talking to people in Russia who were giving him the money to build this cage. He had no idea. So again, this is how information flows from one area, Facebook in this case, to real life action, and sometimes very odd action. But sometimes all it takes these days is just one tweet, right? So this is something that the president tweeted about Amazon, right? Huge company in the United States, important company. And the president tweeted that he may be open to changing the tax structure, right? So that's information that Amazon needs. Are they going to be taxed more? That's an important question, not just for Amazon, but for investors, right? And you see what happened to the stock price. But sometimes a tweet is just a tweet. We still don't know what covfefe means. And actually, Amazon's stock price has rebounded. Because right now in the United States and around the world, in fact, people are trying to figure out what to do with the information coming from the president's Twitter account. What weight to put on it. What's the power of that information? And actually in the United States, we're learning that people are not getting their information directly from the president's Twitter. There's still a media filter very much in effect. But there's many places in the world where there aren't these legacy media outlets. There aren't traditional TV stations, print outlets filled with journalists whose business is the truth, who would never publish anything unless they were sure it was true, right? So what you see here is a Facebook post in Sri Lanka. And this Facebook post did a lot of traffic, and Facebook posts like it. And what it says is that Muslim people in Sri Lanka were poisoning the food of Sinhalese majority in Sri Lanka. This isn't true. But posts like this were shared very broadly in Sri Lanka. This is from a New York Times article. And when these posts went viral, the cost was extreme. This man owned a restaurant and was accused of poisoning food. He was beaten by a mob, his restaurant was set on fire, and he fled. So in these kinds of situations, as we're thinking about the power of information, on platforms where truth is not being prioritized, and there's not mechanisms to figure out what's true, sometimes the information that goes viral is information that is not true and actually can be quite damaging. And in Sri Lanka actually shut down Facebook for a time because there was significant mob violence in that country, and most people access the internet through social media sites. We see something similar in Myanmar. Myanmar, of course, is coming out of a military dictatorship. They don't have the same kinds of institutions where they can trust the information. They're getting a lot of information from Facebook as well. And in Myanmar, where the Rohingya population is under an ethnic cleansing, you see there was a recent spike in violence last year, and at the same time, there was a big spike in nationalistic content, some of it demonizing the Rohingya population. About 300 to 400,000 people fled during that same period where you see the green spike. And so again, there becomes this question of like, how do we know what we know? How is this information spreading? How is it being shared? Information has consequences, right? But it's not just this technological question, right? There is actually this interesting human emotion. Have you guys ever heard of confirmation bias? Anybody? So confirmation bias, everybody, who likes to be right? Do you like it when you're right about something? Do you like it when you're wrong? So confirmation bias is this idea that we seek out information that proves to us what we already thought was true. And actually, scientists say that we get a dopamine rush in our brain, the same that we would get when we have a glass of wine or we see something beautiful, when we find information that tells us what we already thought was true. So actually, in addition to these questions of algorithms, there's really sort of this innate human desire to be right. And there's another emotional factor at play these days, and that is, how many of you guys like reading bad news stories? Do you like reading about war? Do you like reading about famine? We're able to connect with these really horrible things that are happening at any given time, at any place in the world. And there's something that's happening to regular consumers of information, even if you're just consuming information on Facebook, which is called compassion fatigue. You don't want to hear bad news anymore. But the thing is that when we think about a lot of the problems that are facing our world, we often think about it, and those stories and the information is often framed from the perspective of the bad news. So for instance, in the United States, there's currently a big debate about immigration. I know there's similar debates happening across the continent of Europe at the moment as well. In the United States, the way this conversation is currently being framed is in terms of immigration as a problem for the United States. Now, of course, America is a nation of immigrants. My family came to the United States as immigrants. Most people in the United States, their family came as immigrants. But we see here that recently there's been a spike in the number of Americans viewing immigration through this lens as a problem, right? And that's especially the case among people who are supporters of the president, or in his party. And that's in large, and at the same time, we see the president talking about immigration in terms not just of it being a problem, but in terms of violent crime associated with immigrants, even though studies show, information shows, that immigrants are no more likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. In fact, some studies show they're less likely. But again, this is information that's looking at something from the vantage point of a problem. Similarly, in the United States, we talk a lot about crime in terms of as a problem, right? Crime is a problem. But at the same time, we're incarcerating large percentages of our population, and this is very costly in a lot of ways. 5,000 convicted inmates live here in California. I spent about 6 weeks in this prison last year working on a story, but the story that I was working on was less about the problem of violent crime and more about how some people are trying to solve that problem by thinking about their own roles in violent crime. And here's just a little taste of what I found.
Toxic masculinity, what does that mean?
Boys don't cry.
Boys are tough. That nigga backwards.
That's for punks, that's for sissies.
If you keep crying, I'm gonna give you something to cry for. It can be dangerous to be a feminist in prison. We all had these great dreams and stuff when we were little kids, but at some point it was more important for us to be tough. It was more important for us to not back down.
I want the power that comes with vulnerability, but I love being a man at the same time.
Many times we tell ourselves, in order for me to survive, I have to be a man.
You stepped on my ego, I'm feeling some type of way.
Pow!
Mama loves you. That shit didn't mean nothing when I went to school.
People gotta hear me like you can't just lock me up in here and I don't matter for the next 8.5 years.
A lot of them come out even worse than they were before.
We cannot challenge our harmful behavior without challenging patriarchy.
On a real note, how you guys expect me to do that?
Orange jumper, oversized, tears fill my parents' eyes. Judge gave me 40 life, 40 days, 40 nights. Pray the passion.
We don't gotta live like this, y'all.
Give me
When
life,
we go to the
demons
streets
hunt me every night.
and circumstances are different, will we react the same then?
We're a part of the movement.
The whole part of existing in this world has nothing to do with being a man. It has everything to do with being human.
So that's a little taste of what we found. You can find the full documentary on CNN.com if you're interested. But basically, this also gets at this idea of when we're consuming information, are we consuming information on the basis of a problem, or are we consuming information on the basis of how to potentially solve that problem? And I know a lot of you guys in here are doing incredible work solving a lot of problems in your society, right? So I invite you to think about the work that you're doing in those terms. Can you tell more stories, more information from that vantage point? But sometimes, of course, the problem with information is the information is overly positive. And this, too, can be a form of power that can cause some problems as it relates to information. So this is a woman named Elizabeth Holmes. She started a company in 2013 that ended up being valued at $9 billion. The company is called Theranos. They promised to revolutionize blood testing in the United States. She was compared to the next Steve Jobs. She got glowing articles written about her, but there was one problem. The problem was, it wasn't quite clear how her technology worked. Have you ever heard about a technology and you don't quite get it? Well, this technology was explained in this way. A chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by a certified laboratory personnel. Does that make sense to any of you? Well, it didn't make sense to this journalist who worked at the Wall Street Journal either, and so he started asking more questions, questions that hadn't been asked yet about her company. This article is the result. It was published in 2015. Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. But again, the power of information, when the people associated with this company heard that this article was coming out, they flew to New York and had a 5-hour meeting with the journalist boss. 5 hours. Trying to talk them out of publishing this. Since the time that this was published, the company has been charged with fraud. And you see here on the side all the money that was lost as this company went bust. And these are some powerful people, right? The Education Secretary of the United States was an investor. Rupert Murdoch, who owns the company that owns the paper that published the story, he lost a bunch of money too. And this is the power of information. Anyone could have asked this question. But nobody did until this Wall Street Journal article. And that's where I'm going to leave things with you guys. I think we're in this really complicated moment as it relates to the information space. Technology is changing, and there are political pressures as well on the information that we're able to access and what we're able to do with that information. I would just invite you all to think about when it comes to information and information being controlled. Just think about who benefits from information being controlled. I think that might lead to some interesting answers. And beyond that, I'm excited to talk to you all and hear what you're up to. Here's a few ways to find me. I'm also on Facebook, algorithms be damned. And I thank you all so much for your time.